Hello, everyone. Wine Coop here. Just wanna basically go over this PowerPoint with you. This introduction PowerPoint. The slides, you can look at it yourself, but the slides probably won't make sense on their own. So I just want to do some dictation over top of it and just give you some a good discussion about what we're going to talk about this semester in terms of writing and what we're going to look at. And it's also an introduction to Unit 1, the first 5 weeks of the course. So bear with me here as I talk through some of these. Hopefully this won't take as long as it may. But so before we talk about writing, I always poll the class each semester and ask them what do they think of when they think of a writer, right? Who is a writer? What are some writers that they know? And this is usually the image that comes to mind. It's this sort of stuffy person with these horn rim glasses that likes to use a typewriter, and there are these pretentious people that write novels, and the students almost always say a writer is Stephen King or Shakespeare or Edgar Allan Poe or Jane Austen or Nicholas Sparks, Stephanie Meyer, right? These just novel writers. That's almost always who they think of, and that's just not what I mean when I say writer. I mean, those are definitely writers, right? I mean, Ernest Hemingway is definitely a writer. He's one of my favorite writers. He is one of the most famous writers of the 20th century. He won the Nobel Prize for writing. But I don't want you to think that being a writer means you have to be this person, right? That's not what that means. And a lot of people get it in their heads that to be a good writer, they have to be Ernest Hemingway. They have to write like Ernest Hemingway. They have to sell books like Ernest Hemingway did. And that's just not true. In this class, we're going to talk about writing as an activity that we all do every day. And arguably, we do more now than we ever have in the history of humankind. So it's really relevant that we talk about writing in this accessible way. You are writing all the time, and I want you to understand what it is that you're doing. And it's not writing novels, right? Hemingway would go and sit down at cafes and practice his sentences for hours at a time. He would just rewrite sentences to practice that structure. That's how he became as good as he did, but that's not what we're going to be doing in this class. If you want to write novels, great. I highly suggest going to a cafe, working on your sentence structure for 12 hours a day for 10 years, and you'll be a famous novelist. But that's not what we're going to accomplish in this semester. What we're going to accomplish in this semester is understanding writing as an activity, understanding writing as a process. So what is a writer then? A writer might look something like this. This may be you sitting at your desk when you write essays. This is definitely me as I sit at my desk writing anything, screaming at my computer because something's not working or I have writer's block. So this is a more accurate picture than this or this, right? This is us. This is the real person trying to communicate an idea and having a problem or having an issue communicating that idea. So what is it that we're doing? And what do I mean by it? Well, I said in my introduction video that I define writing for this class as the contextual communication of ideas through various genre and media. We're going to talk about all of these words and what they mean in this sentence throughout the semester. And most of them we're going to talk about in this PowerPoint. And basically, I just want to look at writing as communication. It's this thing that we do, it's this activity that we do to share ideas and represent our ideas. And when we do it effectively, our audience understands what we're trying to say, right? So if you've ever been in an argument with your significant other about anything, which I know that you have because I have, it's because they don't understand your position, right? Or they don't understand what it's like to be in your shoes. And if you can't get them to understand it, that means you're being a bad writer. That means you're not doing an effective job of delivering that message. So at the very least, at the end of the semester, you will be a better communicator to your significant other. They will not argue with you as much, or you'll be able to win arguments with them because you're a better communicator. That's my base level goal here for this semester. Now, a couple things that we're going to talk about is writing as a situated, interpretive, and indeterminate act. And because it is those things, among many, many other things, writing is a challenging thing to talk about and understand. But when we understand writing, the more that we understand writing, the better at writing and communicating ideas we will be. So, what does some of this stuff mean? Writing as situated means that it takes part in a larger conversation, a larger context. When we write something, we are reacting to a situation. We're reacting to an event. We're reacting to feelings or emotions, or a place or a time. Even if you're sitting at home writing bad poetry about an emotion or a relationship, right? You are joining in a larger conversation. Whether that conversation is with yourself and you're trying to understand your feelings or emotions about this relationship, or if that conversation is something larger like, the heroin epidemic, right? We're reacting in these situations, and what we have to understand is that when we're writing, we have to understand that situation. If we write something that doesn't understand the situation, or it is not understanding other people involved in the situation, we may not communicate our ideas effectively. And so understanding that writing is a reaction will help us understand better ways to react and reach out to our audience. This also means that we have an audience, that when we are writing, we're trying to reach out to someone and deliver information to them effectively. Even if that audience is yourself. If you're sitting at home writing bad poetry about a bad relationship, you are the audience. And as you write things down on paper, you are then reinterpreting them in your head as you look at them. And so you're engaging a conversation with yourself. How do I feel about this relationship? How do I feel about my significant other? Do I want to keep being with them even though they're being a jerk right now, right? Or whatever. You're engaging in a conversation with yourself in that context. So that's one way to look at it. Now, I'm going to talk about interpretation and indeterminacy in a minute, but before that, we're going to talk about writing as, what are we doing, right? What is good writing, and how do we do good writing? Well, good writing really just means any writing that disturbs or creates dissonance, meaning that it tries to change someone's thinking, or it engages someone in a conversation. Now, it doesn't have to be eloquent. Eloquent writing is not the same as good writing. Eloquent writing might mean a writer is using these highfalutin words and these, SAT type words in a stylistic manner that sounds poetic or musical, right? That's eloquent writing. But what I mean by good writing, to be a good writer, means that you're delivering information that disturbs your audience, that gets your audience to think outside of their own thoughts or belief systems, right? It gets the audience to realize that maybe their beliefs are not the best belief, or they're not the right belief, or they're wrong in their thinking. And this is what I mean by communication, that we're communicating ideas for the sake of persuading an audience. What we're trying to do in every conversation is argue for our version of reality. Now, we're going to talk about worldview in this class. And what I mean by that is each of you has a particular worldview. You understand the world in a way that is different than everybody else because of your upbringing and your understanding of the economy, or your education, or your political views, or your religion. All of these things create who you are, your identity, and they shape how you view the world, right? someone who is religious will look at the world and make choices based on that religion that someone who is not religious will not do. If you are not religious, you will make different choices in your life. You will face aspects of your life in a different way. If you are a conservative Republican, you will make different choices at the ballot box. You will make different choices in your economic decisions than if you were a liberal Democrat. You will value different things based on these beliefs that you hold. If you had a public school education, you will act differently maybe than if you had a private school education, where you were raised, who you were raised by, how many parents you had, how many siblings you have, what sibling, in what order of that childhood were you raised. All these things determine who you are, and it determines how you view the world. And so what we're doing when we're having a conversation really is arguing for our reality, how we view the world, and we're trying to get people to understand how we view the world. And so that's what writing is. It is communicating our reality. Now that's a really big thing. I know that that's maybe a little bit more theoretical than you were expecting. And it's just how it is. But that's what I want this class to be. Understanding that you see the world differently than me will help you be a better writer, because if you know that I view the world differently than you, you will do a better job at knowing how to reach me as an audience member. If you know that your girlfriend hates sports, but you want to watch the big game, you want to watch the Super Bowl, knowing how to make an argument to have a Super Bowl party will depend on who your girlfriend is or your boyfriend is. What would alleviate their hatred of sports for 12 hours so you can have a Super Bowl party? How can you approach the situation to where you can offer them something or get them to understand the importance of the Super Bowl to you, right? So that's what we're talking about here in this class. How do we reach out to an audience and persuade them? Now, to do this, we have to understand what knowledge is, what information is. In this class, we're going to talk about knowledge as a socially constructed thing. And what I mean by that is that everything we know about the world, everything that we know to be true, is socially agreed upon. That's not to say there's not an objective truth out there, right? But objective truth, capital T truth, is really hard to come by. It's really hard to get to. And we're sort of bound by our sensory perceptions. And so what we have to rely on is that information and knowledge is agreed upon. And the example that I always use that most people may or may not know is I talk about marijuana, which may surprise you, but I talk about it because it's something that has changed over the last 100 years. Our understanding of marijuana or cannabis has changed drastically, right? From not really thinking anything about it to it being this terrible class or Schedule 1 drug that, kills people, to now it's this possibly life-altering, life-saving thing that we're getting to know more about, that we're using in medical ways, that we're legalizing recreationally. And what happened there? How did we go from this incredibly illegal drug to this drug that is better than alcohol, it's better than opiates, it's better than ibuprofen in some ways, right? How did we get there? What happened? And what happened is we had a conversation, and the conversation changed over time. When we communicate and we interact with other people, we are sharing ideas and we are carrying the conversation forward. And so these conversations may take place among a few individuals, or they may take place within an entire society. And in the case of marijuana, that conversation has taken place over the last 100 years within our society. And what happened is, 100 years ago, most people didn't think much about it. Marijuana was around. People smoked it, or they didn't smoke it. They didn't know much about it, and it wasn't a big deal. But what happened? One of the things that really changed the conversation was where it was coming from, and cannabis was at the time really growing and coming into this country from Mexico. It grows naturally in that region because of the climate, and Mexicans smoked it. And what happened was, in the early 20th century, you had more Mexicans immigrating into the country that were smoking cannabis. And what is something culturally that Mexicans do? They take a siesta in the middle of the day, and it's something that they do in Spain. It is this, they take a nap in the middle of the day. Now in Spain, it's like a 2-hour window where you can actually go home from work. You can take a nap. You can eat with your family. It is this block of time, and it's actually embedded in the culture. It's something that most companies let their employees do, and it's this really cool thing. And Mexico does the same thing, but because of racism and xenophobia, early 20th century Americans looked at it as, oh, look at these lazy Mexicans. They're smoking this plant and they're taking naps, right? It gets embedded into our culture that this conversation's taking place, and oh, look at what's happening. They're smoking this plant, they're being lazy, they're taking a nap, right? When in actuality it has nothing to do with the plant. It's just a cultural phenomenon that happens. It's something that is embedded in to the makeup of that society, and we didn't understand it, and we looked at it in a negative light. And so that's how it starts, right? Just those little things change the conversation. Now, another thing that was happening too is that the cannabis industry would actually hurt things like the paper industry, the clothing industry, because you can grow this plant really quickly. You can grow hemp very fast in pretty much any climate. You can grow it indoors. It grows rapidly. You can grow it all year round, and you can reproduce it for cheap, right? Paper, you have to wait for a tree to grow, and trees can take a really long time to grow. And so this would hurt things like the paper industry or the clothing industry, because you can make pretty much anything out of hemp. So what happens is people start to lobby. The conversation changes. They start to demonize this plant because they can. And so over time, it becomes sort of taboo, but not right off the bat, right? It takes time. Jump ahead to the counterculture of the 60s, and our conversation about our understanding about cannabis changes, right? We see the hippies of the counterculture movement smoking marijuana, among other things, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? It was not illegal at the time. It was legal, perfectly legal to smoke. But what happens is, we're fighting a war in Vietnam. Nixon sees the counterculture movement as his enemy because the hippies were against the war in Vietnam. Most people were against the war in Vietnam, but he needed to silence them in some way. And how do you do that? How do you go after a group of people? You do that through a number of means. And for Nixon, that was to create the war against drugs. And his goal in the war against drugs was to demonize things like cannabis, and say that the people that smoke cannabis are, they're bad people, they're evil people. They, it makes them crazy, it makes them insane, it's dangerous. So what happens? They schedule these drugs, they put cannabis as a Schedule I drug, and what that means is, for those of you that don't know, cannabis becomes as dangerous as heroin. It's considered to be as lethal and as dangerous as shooting up heroin. That's what a Schedule I drug means. It has no medical purposes. It's cannot be used recreationally. It is of the highest caliber dangerous, right? Now, heroin's a pretty dangerous drug. We know that from the heroin epidemic, right? To date, there are no known overdoses of cannabis. No one has ever overdosed from cannabis. And in any situation where someone has died from after smoking marijuana, it's not from the weed that they died. It was from something like a heart attack or whatever. And maybe the weed exacerbated that, but it wasn't the cause of death, right? And of those cases, there's less than 10 of them on record. Compared to heroin, there are hundreds a day in this country. People die from heroin. Now, what's a Schedule II drug? A Schedule II drug is less dangerous, maybe some medical benefit, but not much. A Schedule II drug is a drug like cocaine or methamphetamine. That means that right now, in this country, cocaine and methamphetamine are more dangerous, considered more dangerous than weed. And the problem here is that because over the last 50 years, we've thought this way, and it's scheduled in this way, we actually can't do, scientists cannot perform legally studies on these drugs in this country because of the way that they're scheduled. And what's really upsetting about that is that in the 60s, drugs were beginning to be experimented on, the psychotropic drugs were beginning to be experimented on for their use in mental illness. What we were learning at the time was that certain drugs like MDMA or psilocybin, which are magic mushrooms, right? These drugs were actually sort of becoming known to be beneficial for treating anxiety and PTSD. Now, skip ahead to 21st century, we're learning more about that now. We're trying to do more research on that now, and we know more about it now. But because of these restrictions, we can't carry on that conversation. We can't discuss these drugs in that way because 60 years ago, they were demonized, right? They were considered to be these evil, evil things. Now, yes, there are some bad drugs out there, right? Heroin is a bad drug. Opiates are bad drugs. We see the damaging effects of this every single day. But there is no medical evidence that cannabis is dangerous. There's no medical evidence that using this drug too much is dangerous. And where writing comes into play, where communication comes into play, is that we've constructed this idea that all drugs are bad if they're not over-the-counter medications, right? If they're not prescribed by your doctor. But today, we talk about cannabis in a completely different light. Multiple states now have legalized this drug and for recreational use and medical use. It's legal medically in Maryland. It's decriminalized as a recreational drug in Maryland. And it wasn't like that. So what happened? So let's get back to the conversation about writing, right? What happened that we went from this thing of being inconsequential to the worst possible thing on the planet to something that could cure, maybe not cure, but could alleviate pain or alleviate the symptoms of anxiety or epilepsy or glaucoma or alleviate and help people with cerebral palsy. How did we get here? And we got there because we had conversations. We carried on conversations and continued to socially construct and agree upon our knowledge, right? And so that's what we do when we write. We are creating knowledge when we write. And so this semester we're going to talk about these different topics, right? We're going to talk about the Columbine shooting. We're going to talk about obsessive compulsive disorder and our understanding of that and our knowledge of that. How do we construct these things socially through writing? These ideas don't appear out of thin air. We didn't just wake up one day and go, oh, weed's not so bad anymore. It didn't just appear. It takes time. These ideas take time, and they're influenced by things like the culture. They're influenced by interpretation. They're influenced by our politics. They're influenced by our social need and our worldviews. And so it's very important to understand these aspects of communication because they really go into the writing process. So Writing is a frustrating process because when we write something to an audience, our audience will interpret it. Now, they will interpret that based on their own worldview. And this is what makes the process very difficult, because to be a good writer, to be an effective writer, you have to understand how your audience is going to interpret your words. Now, usually if this was in class, I'd say raise your hand if you've ever had an argument with your significant other because they did not understand a text message that you sent them, or they took it the wrong way. And pretty much everybody raises their hands, right? And you at home, you know this. You've sent a text message to someone and they took it the wrong way, or you said something to someone and they took it the wrong way. And that's because they interpreted that message in their own way. Now, because writing is interpretive, because inevitably you will interpret somebody else's writing and I will interpret somebody else's writing in our own ways, it means that the way that we as writers communicate a message is not the determined effect it will have on the audience. So we need to understand who is our audience, how will they interpret our writing. And if we can know those things, if we can preemptively determine the way our audience will interpret our writing, that will make our writing better, because we'll address that. We'll rework sentences. We'll use different words to appeal to our audience, because we know what our audience is looking for, that we know that the way that our audience looks at the world. So as I said a couple slides ago, we view the world with different worldviews, right? And it is shaped by our past experiences. Everything that you've experienced in your life, everything that makes you who you are, whether that's your education or your upbringing or your social status or your economic status or your politics, these things make you who you are, and they determine how you will view the world. And the way that we write is influenced by these things as well. So we write using what's called deterministic screens. We use particular language to discuss the world, right? So I'm sometimes known as a very cynical person or a very pessimistic person, and that's, for whatever reason, that's just who I am, right? So when I talk, a lot of times I may approach situations from, the worst case scenario, or I might say, just it's not worth it, or we're going to fail, or this person's being selfish, right? And I'll use language that describes the world in that way. But someone who is an optimist, who looks at everything as there will be a positive outcome, will learn something from this, right? The world is amazing. It's this wonderful place. They will use language that describes the world in such a way. So they'll use more positive language where I may use more negative language. And so we need to understand this. We need to understand that we as writers will use language in this way, and other writers use language in this way. And we're going to look at that. We're going to look at how does Marilyn Manson use he uses expletives in his writing. He uses language that is kind of harsh in his writing. And why does he do that? Is it because he is a mean person, or is it because he's reacting to a particular situation? We're going to look at Ellen DeGeneres. Ellen DeGeneres is using humor. She's using language that appeals to the humor of the audience. That's because she's a comedian, right? And is that because she thinks the world's a funny place, or is she trying to appeal to an audience who appreciates humor? We'll look at things like that, right? So, how do we do this? Week 1, this week, we're looking at the rhetorical situation. And all the rhetorical situation is the relationship between the writer, the message that they're delivering, and the audience that they're delivering that message to. And that all occurs within a context, right? Or a kairos. So you'll notice a few words here, and I want to briefly go over some of these. You have ethos that relates to the writer and speaker, logos, which refers to the message or the text, and pathos, which refers to the audience, right? Now, these words coincide with one another, but they are not synonyms. So please don't think that ethos means writer. That's not what that means, right? They are separate definitions. Ethos refers to the author's credibility, the writer's credibility. Logos refers to the logic or the reasoning behind the message. Pathos refers to emotion, and particularly the emotions of the audience. So I have them here because they relate to one another, but they're not synonyms. So don't think of them that way. And this relationship here creates the context, but also occurs within a context. So if the first thing we're going to read next week is Marilyn Manson and his response to Columbine. So the context that Manson is referring to is the Columbine shooting, right? That's the context. The other context is Marilyn Manson is delivering a message about himself and his music to his detractors, who are his audience, right? So Marilyn Manson, the writer, is delivering a defense of his music to the audience, which is pretty much everybody, but mostly sort of the religious groups that are blaming him for Columbine. Delivering that message to his audience and within the context of the Columbine shooting. So this is what I mean by the rhetorical situation. Whenever we write something, we are writing in that context. It's a relationship of these three parts. And depending on who our audience is, we will maybe change that message to better react and respond to them, or better persuade that audience. So you may be sitting at home writing bad poetry, like I said earlier, writing bad poetry about your relationship, right? And so your audience is probably you writing that bad poetry. Maybe you have no intention of delivering this message to anybody, right? So that makes you the audience member. So this still works because what you're doing when you're sitting down to write is you're communicating this idea. Now you're communicating ideas that are in your head, emotions that you're feeling onto paper, and then you're interpreting those words once they're out. So you are then the audience member interpreting these words and your feelings and understanding, and then reinterpreting them back into your head and understanding them in new ways. So no matter what you're writing or who you're writing to, you're always writing to an audience. And we'll come back to this in the coming weeks of what this is. But this is what I mean by the rhetorical situation. It is the relationship between the writer, the message, and the audience in a context. So why do we do it? I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but basically we write for a purpose. We write to react to a situation. We write to inform people of information and new ideas. And we write to make an argument for reality. We write for change, for new perspectives, for solutions to problems. We communicate because it's how we advance our understanding of the world. It's how we advance our knowledge of the world. And this is the little wrap up to this introduction. There's a few more slides, but why should you care about any of this, right? Because you're all probably sitting here going, well, I'm only taking this class because I have to. It's just a requirement. I'm bad at English. I hate writing, or I'm not a good writer, or I'm not a strong writer. That's what all my students say, right? I know that you don't want to be here, and that's fine. But you should care about this class because it is something that you engage in all the time, and I'm going to try and help you be better communicators. And so this is this quote is from a book from my field. It's this guy James Berlin wrote a book on the history of writing instruction in American colleges. Super boring, I know, but this paragraph is his conclusion to his book. It's basically his thesis to the book, right? And it's I'm going to read it to you, and I'll explain it a little bit. And he says that writing courses, so you're in a writing course, but writing courses are not designed exclusively to prepare students for the workplace, although they certainly must do that. Writing courses prepare students for citizenship in a democracy, for assuming their political responsibilities, whether as leaders or simply as active participants. Writing courses also enable students to learn something about themselves, about the often unstated assumptions on which their lives are built. In short, the writing course empowers students as it advises in ways to experience themselves, others, and the material conditions of their existence, in methods of ordering and making sense of these relationships. So what that means is this course, it's going to prepare you for writing in college. It's going to prepare you for writing in your job because you're going to be doing those things. But at the very heart of it, I want you to walk away this semester better understanding who you are, understanding why you think the way that you do, what you think about and why you think about those things, what influences lead you to think this way, questioning whether or not these are the best ways to think or understand the world, but also realize that you live in this country, you live in a democracy, and I'm not going to get all romantic here, but you live in a world that allows you to have a voice and an opinion, whether you feel like you do or not. You have the right to vote. You have the right to get online and voice your concerns about the world. And I want to help you become better communicators of your ideas so that we can engage in better conversations, so that we don't allow people like a President Nixon to use their platform to say that something like cannabis, right, is dangerous or it should be illegal just because he wanted to silence detractors of a war he was engaging in, right? I want you to be able to, on a more simplistic level, engage in conversation with your friends and family and significant others so that you understand each other better, so that you will be able to communicate how you feel about something or what you think about something without them interpreting it the wrong way, without them misunderstanding you, so that at the very least you can go home, talk to your boyfriend or girlfriend or wife or husband or what have you, and get them to see the world from your perspective, but also to understand the world from their perspective so that you can communicate in a more effective way. So that's kind of the course here. Hang around for a little bit. There's still a few more slides, but that's sort of the introduction to the course and how we're going to talk about writing this semester. These are the sources that I used in the first few slides here. So if you want to check out more, you can look at those sources there and the text there. Now, quickly, I want to go over the first unit, what we're going to talk about this semester in terms of the rhetorical situation and understanding writing as we look at some of these writers in the opening of the class. Now, we're going to be dealing with three specific terms here: genre, audience, and rhetorical situation. Now, you might have noticed that audience is a part of that rhetorical situation. So this just bear with me here. We're gonna be separating audience at some point to talk about them, but the audience does fall into the rhetorical situation. So they're separate terms, but they do relate at the same time. So rhetoric, again, I said, I think in my introduction video, rhetoric is just the faculty of observing the available means of persuasion, right? So we're going to talk about effective writing through the available means of persuasion, the tools that you can use to persuade an audience, to get the audience to see things from your perspective. That's what we mean here by rhetoric. And rhetoric is those tools. It's the tools that you can use. Now, what do we mean by persuade? All I mean by persuade is not necessarily to get someone to think like you or convince someone of your position. All I mean by persuasion is to demonstrate your position, to show someone fully and effectively your position, why you think this way. We are persuaded when an argument has been fully demonstrated to us, when someone has fully laid out their ideas in a logical manner. We are persuaded, if it makes sense, right? If it's effective. So this is either done through self-evident means, meaning that the idea is self-evident, or it's done through evidence. It's done through logic and reasoning and sources and providing evidence and background information to get someone to think this way. So again, back to the rhetorical situation. The rhetorical situation, we've already talked about. It is this relationship between writer, the message, and the audience, right? In the context of which you're writing in. So that's what we mean here. You are going to be defining this in your own terms in the coming weeks. And I want you to understand it in your own way, but I'm just sort of delivering my definition to you here as this relationship. And something to know here is that you should be persuaded by your audience in some way. Depending on who your audience is, you will change the message. You will alter the message so that it will better persuade or better reach out to the audience that you're trying to reach. Now, a few modes of persuasion here, ethos, logos, pathos, that we're going to talk about, and this is important to know. Ethos just means ethics. It is referring to your character as a writer, the writer's character. It means to understand that you should be a good person. People will trust you if you are a good person, but it also means understanding the character of other people. If you are a good person, you will sort of be listened to more, right? People will want to know you and listen to you if they think that you're a good person, or at least have good character. Logos then refers to logic and reasoning. It refers to discourse or reasoned discourse. It basically, these are the proofs or the facts of your argument. This is the evidence that you use to support your argument, to support your statements, right? Logos or logic just refers to the evidence that you're going to be incorporating into your papers. And then pathos here means pathetic, but pathetic in the old sense, not pathetic like we know it now. Pathetic meaning emotional. So referring to human emotion, understanding the emotions, and appealing to those emotions in your writing. You should strive to use all three of these modes of persuasion in your writing. So, you build your character by talking about what you know of the topic, by your connection to the situation at hand. Your logic is the sources that you use, the evidence that you use, the statistics that you use to support your ideas. And then pathos, the emotions, are the ways in which you engage with the audience's emotions, reaching out to them and understanding that they will be affected emotionally through these means. So pathos you see a lot in political arguments. This is when the politician stands up on the platform and he says, oh, I'm just like you. My father came here as a poor, broke immigrant to this country. He worked 4 jobs to put me through school. We had no money, yada, yada, yada. I'm exactly like you because I understand your emotions, right? That's the pathetic argument, the emotional argument, so to speak. And so the way that these interact with the rhetorical situation are that the ethos refers to your credibility as a writer, right? The logos refers to the message that you're delivering and how you effectively deliver that message. And the pathos, again, refers to the audience, the emotions of the audience. These words are not synonymous with one another, like I said before, but they refer to these different aspects of the rhetorical situation, that relationship between writer, message, and audience in a context. So some things that we'll look at here. I just want to cover audience and genre real quick. I want to highlight audience because it's such an important aspect of the rhetorical situation. If you don't understand your audience, everything else in the rhetorical situation will fall apart. If you are unable or incapable of reaching your audience effectively, it doesn't matter what you say. It doesn't matter what your message is or how important it is. If you don't reach them, if you do not get them to believe you or relate to you in some way, you've lost them, right? And so understanding the audience in particular will affect the way that you deliver the message. It'll affect the content of the message, the style in which you deliver it. It will affect the genre of the message being delivered. You might choose a different genre depending on that. And so what do we mean by genre is the mode of delivery. How do we deliver that message? Now, I'm going to use genre a little bit more loosely than you might be used to. Most people think of genre as something like horror, right? The horror genre. Scary tropes that writers use or movies use to scare the audience. Or the comedy genre of using humor and jokes and silly tactics to reach out to an audience. When I'm talking about genre in this semester, I'm really referring to how we deliver the message, the means in which we deliver the message. So that can mean something like horror or humor, but it can also mean the type of writing. So we're going to look at Marilyn Manson, right? He is writing in the genre of an op-ed, an opinion editorial. He is also using argument as a genre. He's making an argument to defend himself in this way. We're going to look at Neil Hilborn's piece, which is a spoken word poem. So he's using poetry. That is a genre. It's a delivery method. He's using the poem as a delivery method. He's also using narrative because he's telling a story. That's another genre that he uses. He's telling a story, a linear story from beginning to end to deliver that message about obsessive compulsive disorder. And he's also using not just poetry, but spoken word poetry. He's delivering it in an oral form, so you're not reading the poem, you're actually listening to it being delivered to you. That's what I mean by genre here. It can have different meanings. I have a list of genres on the Moodle site that you can look at. But we're going to look at why the writers chose these particular genres for these messages. Why wouldn't they choose a different genre? Why, for instance, does Marilyn Manson choose to write an opinion editorial in the Rolling Stone magazine and publish it online when everyone that's attacking him, everyone that's talking about him in the context of the Columbine shooting is doing so on TV? And he addresses this. He says in that piece why he didn't go on TV to deliver that message. And that's important. The genre that he chooses in the medium of print journalism and the internet is important because he understands that if he went on TV, it would be to the detriment of his message. It would hurt the message he's trying to deliver. He would not be able to adequately defend himself on television. And so he chose a particular genre in print journalism because it was the more effective way to deliver that message. And so that's what we're going to look at, right? That's what we're going to be talking about this semester, especially in this first unit. So that's pretty much it. If you have any questions, again, please email me. Let me know if you didn't understand something about this video or you want to know a little bit more. So thank you.